Chapter 5: Real Property and Personal Property. Definition and difference. Much of business of law deals with property. There are actually two different types of property: personal property and real property. This lesson explains the difference between these two types of property. Property. There are two types of property. In legal terms, all property will be classified as either personal property or real property. This distinction between types of property comes from English common law, but our modern laws continue to distinguish between the two. Personal property is movable property. It's anything that can be subject to ownership except land. Real property is immovable property. It's land and anything attached to the land. Normally, piece of property can be easily classified as either personal property or real property. The difference between the two is usually fairly straightforward. However, sometimes it's a little harder to categorize property. Let's look at one example. Let's say that I buy lumber and other building supplies, such as saw, hammer, and some nails. These supplies are personal property. They are movable and they belong to me. Personal property. Let's take a closer look at why this is. Let's look at type of item that are classified as personal property. Personal property include possessions of really any kind, as long as those possessions are movable and owned by someone. Personal property isn't affixed to or associated with land. These movable items are sometimes known as chattels. The law regarding chattels includes those laws covering possession, gift, lost property, abandoned property, and stolen property. Intangible item is simply an item that can be felt or touched for business. Intangible personal property includes items the business owns, such as stock, bonds, intellectual property, money. The law on real property. Real property laws covers many different topics related to ownership and the use of the land. It deals with title and ownership rights, as well as the limitation on those rights. Some of way ownership rights can be limited by government regulation relating to zoning, environmental conditions, fair housing, and other state and local laws. Ownership rights can also be voluntarily limited or shared by agreements such as lease, easement, and ex convenience. Personal property. Personal property is a class of property that can include any assets other than real estate. The distinguishing factor between personal property and real estate or real property is that personal property is movable, that isn't fixed permanently to one particular location. Real property. Understanding personal property. Personal property is also known as movable property, movable, and chattels. Because it is viewed as an asset, it may be taken into consideration by a lender when someone applies for a mortgage or another loan. Things you should know about personal property and real property. Anything that can be legally owned may be called property. All property can be grouped into two main categories: real property and personal property. Personal property can be further classified as a channel intangibles. One reason to know these categories is simply to understand what other property lawyers are talking about. Of course, knowing the categories can also help you decide which rules should apply to a particular item to property, which remedies are available for violation property rights. Lands and building. Real property describes land and things that are attached to the land, which is why land is sometimes called real estate or really, even though wood, steel, and other building. Personal property. Personal property is all property that isn't real property, that is a big category in can be further divided to two subgroups, chattels and intangibles. Personal property chattels. The chattel sometimes refers to all kind of personal property, but often it refers only to intangible personal property as opposed to intangible property. Personal property intangibles. Intangibles are all kind of personal property that aren't intangible, that can be seen or touched. The mere existence of such category of property is meant that in the law, property most accurately refers to rights, not to things. A personal can all sorts of intangible things include the following: bank account, franchise and license, insurance policies, intellectual property such as patent, copyrights and trademark, stock bonds, promissory notes and similar documents aren't themselves valuable and merely represent intangible rights. Currency is sometimes treated as an intangible. Things that can be owned. Some things can be owned all and therefore can private property. Some of basic things such as light, air, and the gas can be owned because they are notary seem common. They belong to the public, and something can be owned because illegal, like heroin. Okay, thank you for listening my presentation. See you. Goodbye.